When Michael looked away from his grandmother in the middle of the 4th of July parade, he didn't do it out of hatred, but out of a fear as old as his own shame. The fear that the ranch office men standing beside him along the boardwalk, hats tipped back and thumbs hooked in their vests, would recognize in that small, stooped woman the blood he himself carried. Assunta moved through the crowd at her own slow pace. Her wooden rosary wound around her wrist, the beads catching the July sun. And when her dark eyes finally found her grandson's face among the young men gathered near the depot, she saw him turn his chin toward the marching band instead, his new waistcoat pressed and his boots polished for the first time in his life, as if that single gesture could erase 12 years of watery soup shared 3 ways, of mended shirts stitched by lamplight, and of prayers whispered over his bed. The winter the fever took his mother and father on the trail west. She said nothing. She lowered her head, pressed the rosary against her palm, and kept walking. Sam, who trailed a few steps behind his brother, crossed the road to her without a second thought, took her arm the way a man takes his grandmother's arm when he has nothing to prove to anyone, and walked beside her the rest of the parade route, hearing the low laughter of a few clerks who noticed. It didn't trouble him. He'd grown up hearing the same Hail Marys she murmured every dawn before setting out for the fields, had watched her hands crack and bleed from wringing wash water in winter, and had never once found shame in it. Only a kind of quiet awe at a woman who could carry so much on so little. Michael, on the other hand, felt that every glance the town cast toward Assunta was a glance that landed on him too, reminding him exactly where he came from just when he was working hardest to leave it behind. Before we go further with this story, I'd love to know what part of the country you're joining us from today. Leave the name of your town or your state down in the comments, because a story like this always sounds a little different depending on the port you're listening from. That same evening, while Assunta sat mending a coat Sam had torn on a fence wire, Michael came through the door with his jaw tight and his eyes sliding away from hers, the way a man's eyes slide away when he's carrying a guilt he hasn't yet found words for. She looked at him for a moment, set her needle down in her lap, and asked in the voice she never raised, not even to scold, "You eat supper up at the ranch house? Or did you just bring home hunger for something else?" Michael didn't answer. He sat by the stove without shrugging off his new coat, and for a second it seemed he might explain himself. Might say something about why he'd turned his face away during the parade, but the words got caught somewhere between pride and shame. And all he managed was that he was tired, that the work up at the ranch office weighed heavier than she could understand. Assunta went back to her mending without pressing him further, though her hands this once trembled a little more than usual over the cloth. It was Elias Cordwell who found Michael 2 weeks later, out behind the bunkhouse where the young man was oiling a saddle that wasn't his with the same careful attention he might have given his own future, if only he'd known how. The visiting businessman had a particular way of walking, unhurried as though time itself answered to him, and his voice, when he finally spoke, came smooth as good whiskey. "I've noticed, young Moretti, that you carry yourself like a man meant for more than oiling other men's leather," he said, stopping beside him with his hands folded behind his back, watching the late sun catch the buckle. "A man with your bearing oughtn't spend his whole life fetching and carrying for other people's fortunes." Michael looked up, startled that someone so close to Mr. Whitcomb would take any notice of him at all, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something close to pride. Cordwell offered nothing that first day, nor the second, nor the third. He simply appeared, made conversation, asked after Michael's family with an interest that seemed almost genuine, though every question carried its own quiet hook. "And your grandmother?" he asked one afternoon, the two of them watching the ranch hands break a new colt from the shade of the corral fence, the one who walks to mass every morning with those beads wrapped around her wrist. Michael felt his face go hot, and stammered that yes, his grandmother was a devout woman, trying to make the words sound like pride instead of the shame he actually felt. Cordwell smiled thinly, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and remarked, as though it hardly mattered, "Some men climb high in spite of where they started, Michael, and some men climb high precisely because they learned to set down the weight other folks hung around their necks before they were even old enough to walk." The young man said nothing, but the words lodged in him like a splinter under the skin, aching every time he pictured his grandmother's plain shawl among the parade crowd, The invitation came on a moonless night, when Cordwell caught him alone near the depot platform and spoke of a private gathering, reserved for men of real ambition, men willing to pledge themselves to something larger than the small, old country devotions they'd been raised on. He promised standing with Mr. Whitcomb, protection from any man who might cross him, and money enough that no other clerk his age could dream of it. He asked only one thing in return: that Michael be willing to set aside once and for all any loyalty that might keep him from giving himself fully to the new brotherhood, forming quietly inside the ranch's back offices, a society the men called the Prairie Concord. Michael, his heart caught somewhere between fear and ambition, agreed to attend, telling himself he'd only go to listen, that nothing bound him to commit to something he didn't yet fully understand. The room they led him into that night was lit by only a handful of black candles set in a circle, and the air smelled of melted wax layered under something heavier, something Michael couldn't name but that turned his stomach cold all the same. 5 other young men stood waiting, clerks and ranch hands and the sons of small merchants, all wearing the same ambitious, half-frightened look he suspected was on his own face. Cordwell, dressed head to toe in black with no watch chain, no ring of office, nothing to mark his standing beyond the room itself, presided over the circle with a calm more unsettling than any threat could have been. And when he began speaking of the brotherhood, of the absolute loyalty it demanded, of setting aside any devotion that might divide a man's heart, Michael felt he ought to leave, that every word spoken in that room carried him one step further from everything he'd known. But he didn't move. The fear of being left out, of going back to being the barefoot widow's grandson, weighed heavier than the fear of what he didn't understand. When his turn came to speak the oath, Cordwell handed him a sheet of paper with no seal and no signature he recognized, and asked him to repeat after him a string of words that sounded, to Michael's ear, like some twisted mockery of the Hail Marys his grandmother murmured each night by the stove. The young man felt something inside him close, like a door slamming shut in an empty house, and when he finished, Cordwell laid a cold hand on his shoulder and said, with a smile that for the first time seemed to reach his eyes, "Now you belong to something bigger than any dirt road out to the parish church, boy. Now nobody's ever going to look at you with pity again." Michael nodded, though somewhere in his chest, without knowing quite why, he felt he'd just lost something he wouldn't be able to name until much later. The days that followed brought a strange kind of prosperity. Mr. Whitcomb himself began taking notice of Michael, handing him tasks of greater trust, and the same clerks who used to snicker behind his back now sought his company with a deference they'd never shown him before. But at night, once the bunkhouse fell quiet, Michael began waking in a cold sweat, unable to recall exactly what he'd dreamed, only certain that something watched him from the dark corner of the room. He stopped going to Sunday Mass, blaming the demands of the ranch office, and when Sam asked why he no longer said the rosary with them like before, Michael answered with a sharpness that didn't feel like his own, telling his brother that old women's prayers had no place in the life of a man trying to rise in the world. Assunta, who watched all of this unfold in silence from her corner by the stove, never once reproached her grandson. Instead, she began rising before dawn to pray for him, kneeling on the cold floor of their small house, holding the rosary that had walked every road of her life between her fingers. One morning, Michael caught her like that, and something in him, something the Prairie Concord hadn't yet managed to snuff out completely, stirred with a mixture of shame and anger. "Why do you keep after me with your old country superstitions, Nonna?" he snapped, hard enough that the old woman's hands trembled around the beads. "I'm not a boy anymore. That needs praying over like he's sick." Assunta looked at him then, and there was no reproach at all in her dark eyes, only a sadness so deep it was nearly unbearable to witness. "I'm not praying for a sick boy, Michael," she answered, steady as ever. "I'm praying for a man who's losing his way without knowing he's lost it." That same evening, Cordwell called Michael into the small back office above the ranch's ledger room, a place the young man had never once set foot in before. The businessman received him with a glass of whiskey Michael didn't touch, and spoke this time without any softness, of the next test the Concord required of its most promising men, a heavier oath, spoken before the full brotherhood, that would seal his loyalty permanently and beyond question, above any tie of blood, faith, or memory. Michael felt the same cold from that first night settle back into his chest, and for one instant, just one, he thought of his grandmother kneeling by the stove, holding her small wooden rosary between her hands as though it alone could hold back all the darkness in the world. Michael didn't sleep that night. He lay awake on his cot, listening to the wind rattle the bunkhouse shutters, Cordwell's words circling through his mind alongside the memory of his grandmother's steady face. He knew a second oath would carry him further than ever from everything he'd known before taking the clerk's job. And yet, when morning came and he splashed cold water from the basin onto his face, he told himself he'd already gone too far to turn back now. The fear of becoming the barefoot widow's grandson again, that boy who mended coats by the stove, weighed heavier than any warning his own conscience might whisper. He walked out to the corral with his face set, determined to present himself before the Brotherhood that very night, though some small, quieter part of him wished something, anything, would stop him before it was too late. That same afternoon, however, Assunta announced she'd be walking out to the neighboring settlement the next morning, as she did every year around this time, carrying a basket of her fine needlework to sell at the general store there to help the family through the winter. Sam offered to walk with her, but she insisted he stay behind to mind the chickens and the milk cow, assuring him she knew the road by heart and that Our Lady had walked beside her on that same stretch of prairie for more than 40 years without ever once failing to keep her safe. Michael, who overheard the exchange from the doorway, said nothing, though something in the careful way his grandmother wrapped the small rosary before tucking it into her apron pocket left an odd tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name and chose, as he'd chosen to ignore so many other things these past weeks, to let pass. The road to the neighboring settlement cut through a stretch of low timber, where the trees grew close enough that the noon light barely reached the ground, and it was there, at the bend where the trail narrowed between two dry creek banks, that three drifters fell on Assunta with the sudden violence of men who knew the land and the loneliness of it well. They shoved her down, tearing the basket from her hands, and when she, still on the ground, tried to shield the small rosary against her chest, one of the men struck her with the back of his hand, knocking her sideways against the hard-packed earth. It was in that same instant, from the rise where he'd cut across on a shortcut, carrying a message for another conquered man in the settlement, that Michael saw the scene from a distance. His grandmother's small, bent form on the trail, the three men crouched over her, and his own hand, which had risen instinctively toward nothing at all since he carried no weapon, freezing halfway up. He couldn't explain to himself afterward why he didn't run down. He told himself, in the same instant his legs went weak and his heart pounded with a fury he didn't recognize as his own, that he was too far off, that the men were three and he was alone, that anything he tried would be useless. But somewhere underneath, in the place where the lies he'd been telling himself for weeks no longer had any room to hide, Michael knew it was fear. The same old fear that had walked him into that room of black candles, that had nailed his feet to the ground while his grandmother lay struck down on the trail. When the drifters finally rode off with the basket, Michael ran down the rise, but by then the road stood empty, and he found no trace of Assunta except a dark stain on the packed earth, and beside it, the small wooden rosary, its cord snapped, lying in the dust. And here it's worth pausing a moment, because this story isn't only about Assunta, or about a bend in a prairie road, or about a wooden rosary left lying in the dust. It's about every moment when the fear of what others might think holds us frozen right when someone who gave us everything needs us to step forward. In every generation there are men who mistake standing for courage, and men who learn too late that no favor from the powerful is worth more than being able to meet the eyes of the person who raised them. If you've ever felt fear hold you still in a moment you couldn't later forgive yourself for, stay with this story, because some guilt feels like it will destroy us, when really it's the door to the one truth that can heal us. Michael came back to town with the broken rosary clutched to his chest and the certainty, settled now like a stone in his gut, that his grandmother had died because of his cowardice. He ran straight to the Moretti house expecting only the silence of absence, and instead found Father Brennan stepping out the front door, his face grave, wiping his hands on a cloth stained with dried blood. "She's alive," the priest told him before Michael could even ask. though the beating was hard and the fever hasn't broken yet. The young man felt his legs give out beneath him, and he sank down onto the porch step, unable to bear the weight of his own relief tangled up with his shame. It was then that Father Brennan, watching him with those small, steady eyes that seemed to see more than they let on, added something that finished breaking the young man apart inside. She could barely speak when they carried her in, but the first thing she asked before they'd even tended her wounds was that I pray for you, Michael. She said your name before her own. That night, Michael didn't go back to the ranch. He sat beside the cot where Assunta lay burning with fever, holding the broken rosary he'd picked up off the trail between his hands, and for the first time in months, he wept without holding back, without caring whether some ranch hand might see him or mock him for it. Assunta, half-conscious, opened her eyes at some point deep in the night, and seeing him there, lifted a trembling hand to touch his cheek. "Don't cry, son," she whispered, her voice cracked with fever. Tears of shame are prayers too if you let them fall with a humble heart. Michael took that hand between his own, and for the first time since he'd spoken that first oath in the room of black candles, felt something in his chest. That door slammed shut, began to creak open again, painfully, like a wound starting to heal. 2 days later, with Assunta out of danger though still weak, Michael found Father Brennan in the small mission church and confessed, his voice breaking, holding nothing back. The oath he'd sworn up at the ranch, the Prairie Concord, and the second, heavier oath still hanging over him like a sentence. The priest listened without interrupting even once, and when Michael finished, he sat in silence a long moment before speaking. "What you swore has no hold over a soul that repents with a true heart," he said finally. "But that hold only breaks if you have the courage to renounce it in front of the very men who watched you swear it, and to accept whatever comes after, whatever that may be." Michael felt the old fear rise again, stronger than ever, because he knew that renouncing the oath publicly meant losing everything he'd gained at the ranch, and maybe more besides. When Cordwell learned, through one of his men, that Michael had gone to see the priest, he wasted no time riding into town with the same cold calm as always, though this time something different sat beneath the surface, an urgency he couldn't quite hide. He found Michael by the depot water tower and spoke low, reminding him of the oath, of the cost of breaking a pledged loyalty, of the standing and protection he'd lose for good if he insisted on this foolishness of confessions and public renunciations. "Mr. Whitcomb trusts me, Michael, not some country priest or a superstitious old woman," he said, with a smile that for the first time showed something close to teeth bared. "Think hard before you act, because men who leave the conquered don't find a welcome anywhere after." Michael, though, found that words which weeks earlier would have frozen him with fear now slid off him like water off a hard-packed road, because there was something he feared far more than losing the ranch's favor, remaining for the rest of his life a man who'd let his own grandmother nearly die on a lonely road out of cowardice and vanity. The town meeting gathered 3 days later on the courthouse lawn, called officially to settle a dispute over grazing rights along the creek. But Michael asked the mayor's permission to speak before the business of the day began. He stood up in front of the whole gathering, his hands shaking but his voice steady, and confessed publicly the oath he'd sworn in the ranch's back office, the secret brotherhood Cordwell had built, and his own cowardice on the road that day, holding back none of the hardest details. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd, and a few of the ranch clerks standing nearby traded uneasy glances, like men wondering if they'd be named next. It was then that Cordwell, arriving unannounced, pushed through the crowd with his face pale under a barely controlled fury, ready to deny every word, to accuse Michael of madness or betrayal, to silence with his standing as Whitcomb's trusted man any truth that threatened to unmask him in front of the whole town. It was in that moment that Assunta, leaning on Sam's arm but walking under her own strength, made her way to the center of the courthouse lawn, holding the small rosary in her hands, its cord already mended. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point a finger at Cordwell or speak a single accusation against him. She simply stood beside her grandson, lifted the small rosary to the level of her chest, and said, in that same steady voice that had walked every road of her life, "This man has no hold over anyone who chooses to walk back toward the truth. I've watched my grandson walk the roads of this town same as I have, even if he wears finer clothes than mine now." The whole lawn fell silent, and something in Cordwell's face, something that had stayed perfectly composed until then, cracked for just an instant, showing beneath it the hollow mask of a man who only ever held power over those who feared him. Without a word, he turned and left the meeting, and no one in town ever saw him again after that day. Mr. Whitcomb, once he learned the full truth of what had happened, let Michael go from the ranch office, though not with the public disgrace the young man had braced for, only a stern warning about the judgment and discernment any man ought to carry if he hoped to serve with honor. Michael accepted the loss of his position without complaint, knowing he'd gained back something worth far more than any standing at the ranch. In the weeks that followed, he walked beside his grandmother again on the road to Mass every Sunday morning, never once looking away when others saw them together, and when the weight of the basket or the tiredness in her legs slowed her step. It was Michael now who carried the small rosary in his own hands, so that she could walk the road at last with her hands free and her heart at peace. If you've ever felt shame over something that really deserved your deepest gratitude instead, write humble down in the comments below, because there are quiet kinds of love we only ever come to recognize fully when we're about to lose them.